all indications are showing this should be, and all the polls are showing President Trump up by 5 to 8 points. I expect that trend to continue. I don't think that Kamala's doing anything to help herself. I think, frankly, they're doing more to hurt themselves every time they go step on a stage somewhere. Now you have Joe Biden, who's not even in the race, should be the one that's in the race, because the way they did this was just shenanigans in the first place. But then he calls all the half of the American public garbage, much very in line with Hillary Clinton's deplorable comment years ago. And I think those things actually matter to Americans.
Before we continue, please help the algorithm boost our reporting that asks the questions others won't by liking this video, clicking subscribe, and turning on all notifications. Thanks for supporting the Daily Signal. Now back to the video.
Well, Mark Lamb is the sheriff for Pinal County in Arizona. He has been with us before on this podcast. And Sheriff, I am so glad to welcome you back to the show just a handful of days before the election. Thanks so much for taking the time to join the Daily Signal podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on. And thank goodness we're only a few days away. I think every American has election fatigue at this point.
I think so. We're just all ready for it to be done. And certainly for the folks in Arizona, a swing state, you guys have just been hammered with so much campaign news and campaign ads from both sides. And that's not surprising when you look at the fact that in the last election in 2020, razor thin margins, you had Biden receive 49.4% of the vote and Trump received 49.1% of the vote. Is it going to be that razor thin again in Arizona, do you think, this time?
No, I don't. All indications are showing this should be, and all the polls are showing President Trump up by 5 to 8 points. I expect that trend to continue. I don't think that Kamala's doing anything to help herself. I think, frankly, they're doing more to hurt themselves every time they go step on a stage somewhere. Now you have Joe Biden, who's not even in the race, should be the one that's in the race, because the way they did this was just shenanigans in the first place. But then he calls all the half of the American public garbage, much very in line with Hillary Clinton's deplorable comment years ago. And I think those things actually matter to Americans. And while we're struggling financially, the border's a mess. Our economy's not great. Debt is increasing. I don't think people want to hear that kind of nonsense. And so I don't see that it's trending well for Kamala Harris, and nor should it. I mean, frankly, how she could even be considered for this job after this horrible performance over the last 3.5 to 4 years, especially as it relates to the border and the economy.
I was just in North Carolina, which is also a swing state, and I was chatting with voters there. The three issues that I repeatedly heard voters in North Carolina bring up are the economy, the border, and abortion. Is that largely, as you have talked to voters in your state, both during your run for Senate and just as a member of law enforcement, as a sheriff there, as someone who's regularly interacting with the folks on the ground, are those the main three issues, or are there some others that are really top of mind for Arizonans?
Well, let's be realistic. The top issue is border. But what they do is they've changed the polls recently to say immigration. When you change the vernacular from border security to immigration, then it falls to number 2 behind the economy. But I think the economy and border security are right there, one and two, really close, and they probably go back and forth. The only reason abortion is even it's because the left thinks this is they think this is the silver bullet, which is sad, that the taking of the life of an unborn child is their hinge point for their campaigns and for their platform. And the only reason abortion is as high as it is because they've made such an issue with it. And the reason they've done that is because they have failed in so many other categories: border, national security, global politics. They've failed on the border. They failed in the economy. I mean, the list goes on. And so what they're doing is they're trying to hinge these campaigns and make that abortion issue creep to the top. They want voters to be single issue voters. They're trying to deceive the voters into thinking that this is about women's health, and that the only way you can care about women's health is if you're pro-abortion. And that's just not true. I think you can absolutely be pro-life. There's nothing wrong with being pro-life. That should be the stance that the majority of Americans have. But the left wants to make this a priority issue. And they don't ever really talk about the taking of the life of the unborn children. They talk about the women's health, but they want voters to be single issue voters. And I would implore, whether we agree or don't agree, most Americans are never going to agree 100% on this issue. What I would ask you to do is do not let the politicians in DC play you and make you a single issue voter, because that is what they want. They don't want you to think about the other issues that are affecting not just a portion of Americans, but that are affecting all Americans. And that's the economy, the border, national security, social security, crime in the communities. I mean, all of these things are things that we should be thinking about, because those affect all Americans. And I would hope that Americans, whether you're passionate about this issue or not, please don't forget about the other issues and the Americans and how it affects us.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned crime, and I know that that's one that's also really top of mind for many voters, especially for voters that maybe live in more urban areas and cities that have really seen an uptick in those incidents. As a sheriff in Arizona, what have you all seen over the past several years as it relates to crime? Have you seen an increase?
Well, we've been fortunate enough in our county to reduce our crime index year after year, despite the fact that on a national level it seems to be increasing. But that's because we hold people accountable and we uphold the rule of law, but we protect people's constitutional rights. And so what that does is it fosters a community where people want to live. What you see is where they have gone soft on crime, where they've eliminated bail, or they have not held criminals accountable, or they say you can steal $951 of stuff before they're going to hold you accountable. Those types of bad policies, which usually stem back to the county attorneys or the state attorneys or the district attorneys, who have allowed politics to permeate into what should be a common sense issue, which is upholding the rule of law. And so what we've seen is communities have fallen apart, and they're not holding criminals accountable. They want to hold the average common person accountable, but not the criminals. And now we're seeing an influx of crime involving illegals. And to give you a perfect example of that, people don't want to accept this, and they want to continue to say, well, it's not illegals committing crimes. They're not all criminals. No, nobody's saying they're all criminals. But what we are saying is the numbers don't lie. And the FBI statistics, first of all, they don't even, when we fill out the statistics, because the FBI statistics don't come from them, they come from us in local law enforcement. We pass the statistics on to them. But there is no box to check on their statistics for somebody who's in this country illegally. So how do they know what kind of crimes are being committed? But what we do know is, here's a perfect example. Just recently, after the hurricane down in the Tampa area, the sheriff reported that they had 45 arrests. 41 of those people that they arrested out of the 45 were illegals. And they contacted 196 suspicious people that maybe they couldn't actually attribute a crime to, but they were suspicious. They were in the bad area. Maybe they caught them before they were going to do it. Out of the 196 that they had contact with, 163 of them were illegal as well. So those numbers alone tell a different story. And I think that we cannot ignore the fact that we've allowed a lot of criminals to come in to this country over the last 4 years under this administration's poor policies.
Yeah. It is fascinating to see how those border issues have really been thrust into the limelight, because it has all of a sudden been such an issue that, people have always been aware of, okay, we have to have secure borders, but it wasn't top of mind like it is now. In speaking with voters in various states across the country, I think it's really fascinating to see that is such a top of mind issue, and that polling indicates that as well consistently. For folks in your home state of Arizona, since Arizona is a border state, how are they thinking about this issue?
Well, we're fed up with it. But it doesn't impact us in Arizona. We get the jumping off point. This is where they come through. This is where they smuggle, like through my county. I'm not a border county. I'm one county off. But everybody who smuggles drugs or people ultimately is probably going to come through my county so they can get to Phoenix and then distribute it throughout the rest of the country. But if I were to line 20 people up that came into this country illegally and ask them, where are you going to go? Not one of them will say Arizona. Every one of them will say California, Massachusetts, New York, Chicago, Iowa, Alabama. I mean, they're mentioning every other state but ours. So we don't oftentimes get where they stay in Arizona. And a lot of that is because we have a ton of border patrol. We have a ton of ICE. But what we are feeling is, just like every state and every American family, is we're feeling the effects of fentanyl. Look, I've been out talking about the effects of border for 8 years that I've been the sheriff. Look, it was really good under President Trump, and he listened to us. We had a seat at the table, and he wanted to achieve success, and he did because he worked with local law enforcement. To the contrary, this administration, to my knowledge, has not met with a single sheriff. We don't have a seat at the table. They don't care what we think. They're just doing what they want, which is not secure the border, and it's having an impact on not just Arizona anymore, but it's having an impact on the rest of the country, and especially as it relates to fentanyl. Fentanyl poisoning has become the leading cause of death in America between the ages of 18 and 45. We are losing over 100,000 Americans a year right now to fentanyl poisonings. How is this not a talking point on the media, on the news every single night? I'm going to put this into perspective, and I don't want to take away from 9/11, but I want to put it into perspective. On 9/11, we lost, I think, about 3,600 American lives that day. We're losing 100, and we went to war for 20 years for that, by the way. Right now, China is putting fentanyl in the hands of the cartels. They're bringing it in without firing a single shot or setting off a single bomb. They're managing to kill 100,000 American civilians a year, and our government doesn't talk about it. They don't talk about it in their politics. I don't hear I don't hear Kamala Harris talking about it when she's talking in her things. So to me, that is very disingenuous to the American people. And I think the majority of Arizonans and American people are wise to what's happened over the last 4 years.
Yeah. Are the precursor chemicals for fentanyl, are they predominantly still coming from China, or are they now mainly coming from Mexico, where the cartels have gained that ability to create the full drug in Mexico?
No, they're still, to my knowledge, they're still predominantly coming from China.
Okay.
And, look, even if Mexico can produce it, it's probably coming at a much cheaper rate coming from China. Look, these are the opium wars of the 1800s, 1893. A lot of Americans are not students of history anymore. They don't know what the opium wars were. While we didn't do that, that was England to China, they still consider us part of the West. And look, they've been very patient. And I think a lot of people think that China is our friend. They're not. They do not have our best interests in mind. If they could crush our economy and crush our country and freedom, they would do it in a second if they could. And so you cannot be naive enough to think that there's not some ulterior motive. Here's the thing about the beauty of being in police work. The average person has the luxury of bliss. They think of everything is okay and that there's no bad people in the world. And oh, no, our government would never want to do that. Oh, no, China would never want to do that. The beauty of being in law enforcement is, and it's also a bad thing, is we get to see and face evil every day. And we see the depths that humans will go to hurt one another, to take advantage of one another. And fortunately for Americans, they have law enforcement that hold the line, and they don't see the bad stuff in society for the most part, because we take care of it. But I think Americans more and more are seeing more and more. And don't be naive to think that people don't have bad intentions. Even people in our own country, they can have very bad intentions.
Why do you think this conversation around fentanyl isn't talked about? Why is this not talked about on the news every night? Why are the campaigns not bringing this up during every single speech?
Because if you talk about fentanyl, you have to acknowledge the fact that you allowed 100,000 Americans to die that you could have stopped, by the way, because we know where the fentanyl comes from. Over 50% of the fentanyl in America, throughout the whole country, comes through Arizona's borders. We know who produces it. We know who brings it into this country, yet our government doesn't do anything about it. And to talk about it would mean you'd have to accept responsibility to it. And to accept the responsibility would cost you an election. You would have to acknowledge the fact that you allowed 100,000 Americans to die because you failed to secure the border or to stop those drugs or to hit those drug dealers and treat them as the terrorists that they are. And so why would they want to talk about that as politicians? Because that would inevitably lead back to them. And I believe that's why they don't talk about it. That would certainly be disastrous for their campaigns. And it should. Like, we as Americans, in Arizona in 2021, we had 33 children die from fentanyl poisonings. 7 were under the age of 1. I mean, those statistics alone should get your elected officials unelected, you know? But we as Americans don't seem to want to hold our elected officials accountable. And we're because we're offended by the way somebody talks or the things they tweet. We're willing to go down the same road to destruction because our feelings might get hurt. I'm sick and tired of people and their hurt feelings. Look, I care about everybody, but I care about the country and I care about everybody to the point where I'm willing to speak out and fight for what is right. And I'm sorry, but feelings are going to get hurt along the way when you try to protect your country.
Yeah. For whoever is elected, whether it's Trump or Harris, if you were offering them advice and saying, hey, day one in addressing our situation at the border and addressing the situation with fentanyl, you need to do X, what would you say?
Day one, hard shutdown. You got to take control of the border. You have to. Put your Border Patrol agents back out on the line because they're not. They're in there processing people. No more asylum claims. Keep the Remain in Mexico program. Restore that. Get that back in place. Those are all things you can do day one. Stop the funding to the NGOs. No more tax dollars. We don't have tax dollars, and we certainly don't have tax dollars to go to people to pay for hotel rooms and gift cards and plane tickets and cell phones and all these other things that they're giving people that have come into this country illegally. And when people commit crimes, immediate removal from the country. Like you have to have some hard lines or people will continue to take advantage of our country. You can't let these people take advantage of programs that are in place to help Americans. We have veterans who are struggling. We have American families who are struggling. We saw firsthand what happened, the slap in the face that our federal government gave to the people out in North Carolina, the other victims of that hurricane that went through there, Hurricane Helene, and then down in Tampa. You know, there was no money left for the Americans. And when there was, they said, well, you can have $700, but the hoops that they made them jump through just to get it, only to have to pay it back when they come back on their taxes, is really a slap in the face while they're giving thousands of dollars to people that came into this country illegally or here on a false asylum claim. Like, that has to stop. And then what we start to do is we hold Congress and Senate accountable. You know, we've got to figure out a way to hold their feet to the fire so that they pass common sense immigration reform, which would in essence help us secure the border as well. But day one, executive orders, restore a lot of those executive orders that President Trump has, which is why it makes him the best candidate for this job, because this is one of our number one priorities. Between the economy and border, those are both things that he has done an excellent job on in his previous and in his presidency. And why would we not put the guy that did a good job in place instead of keeping the people that actually tore it to pieces?
Sheriff, before I let you go, I want to get your opinion on, will we know who won Arizona on election night, or do you think it's going to take longer to learn who won the state?
Look, I'm pretty disappointed in the way we're doing elections in Arizona. It's ridiculous that in 2024 we can't give you a number the night of the election. Especially now, what we're seeing is more and more Republicans and Democrats are turning their ballots in early. This should give you the ability to have a pretty good count the night of the election, along with the votes that came in on election day. You should be able to give the people a pretty darn good idea. But unfortunately, they're already forecasting it could take 10 days before they give you a final number, which I think just it just makes people think. It creates uncertainty. It clouds the situation. It makes Americans feel like we're being cheated. And I think they can do much better. I think they've got to revamp a lot of our voting laws, early voting laws. I think there needs to be some serious changes. But sadly, I would like to tell you, Virginia, that they're going to have a number that night. Unless it's Fox News, they called it 30 minutes after the numbers dropped the last time. So who knows? But I'm not highly optimistic in the way we're running elections in Arizona.
Well, Sheriff Mark Lamb, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate your analysis on this election and specifically the state of Arizona.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.